Welcome to the third session on today's day 2 of the A4S Summit 2022, where we're exploring nature, climate and people, and thinking about some of the actions we need to take and the solutions that are out there. I'm really pleased to welcome to this session Robert Costanza. He is Professor of Ecological Economics at the Institute for Global Prosperity at University College London, and a real leader for many years on the question of planetary boundaries, understanding how nature, people and climate intersect along with the economy. So I'm really delighted to have Robert with me today, and we're going to explore how to live well within planetary boundaries. Robert, welcome.
Thank you, Jessica. It's great to be here. Well, first of all, let me point out that we're living in a whole new geologic epoch, the Anthropocene, as it's been called, because of the magnitude of human influence on our ecological life support system. And I think that means that, business as usual really is no longer an option. We have to think and act quite differently if we hope to create a sustainable and desirable future, which I think should be our goal. And I'll get more into that, because I think that's an important distinction, that we have to move away from our current goals of simply maximizing GDP growth toward a much broader goal of building a good Anthropocene, building a sustainable and desirable future. And we know that in this epoch, we are coming close to, if not exceeding, several planetary boundaries, as they've been called. Climate change is probably the most frequently talked about, but there's also the biodiversity crisis. There's the nitrogen fixation crisis that we're facing. So there are 9 planetary boundaries that have been identified and studied. And the point is, we have to recognize that we do live on a finite planet, and that infinite material growth of economies is simply not possible on this finite planet, nor is it desirable. So I think our challenge really is, how do we live well within those planetary boundaries? And the living well part, I think, is equally important. What do we mean by well-being? How do we create that well-being? And so Kate Rayworth, for example, has a nice diagram, showing the planetary boundaries as the ceiling, and the social foundation as the floor. And we need to have all of the components that contribute to human well-being while staying within those planetary boundaries. So I think that's our challenge going forward. And to do that, I think we're going to have a whole new vision of what economics is, what the economy is, how it functions, and ultimately what it's for. Because I think the economy really should be about building that sustainable well-being for humans, but also for the rest of nature. And I say it in that way very explicitly. It's not that people and nature are separate things. People are part of the natural system. And I think in the Anthropocene, even more than ever, we need to recognize that interdependence between people and the rest of nature, and recognize that the economy is really embedded within society, and that's embedded within the natural environment, the rest of nature. So it's a different view of what the economy is, and I think it brings up a whole different way of understanding how to manage that system and what our priorities are. For example, the recognition that the natural environment, the rest of nature, provides a whole range of services, valuable services that we depend on. Things ranging from conventional provisioning type services like water and fuel, but also a whole range of regulating services, regulating the climate, protecting us against storms, providing fresh water. So there's a long list of ecosystem services that we've been studying for decades now, and trying to estimate, in units that people can understand, how valuable are they relative to other things. And we've estimated that they're in fact much more valuable than everything that's measured in GDP, and becoming more endangered over time as we begin to exceed these planetary boundaries and have massive impacts on those ecosystem services. So this all relates to how do we measure well-being? What actually contributes to human well-being? And there's been a lot of research recently in positive psychology, as it's called, that looks at, well, what really does affect people's sense of well-being. Certainly their consumption of material goods and services contributes, but it's by far not the only thing. And in many cases, not the main thing, at least beyond a certain level of sufficiency. And after that, it's interaction with others in the community, with their family, with their friends, their social capital, as it's been called. And it's their interaction with and support from the natural environment, the natural capital and ecosystem services that I'm talking about. So there have been many attempts to get beyond GDP as a measure of social goals of public policy, and those measures show consistently that we're not really measuring the right things. GDP was never designed as a measure of societal progress. It really only measures economic activity and only marketed economic activity. And some of that activity are things that we really don't want more of. We don't want more crime. We don't want more air pollution. We don't want the climate to deteriorate. And yet those things are all measured as positives in GDP because somebody has to deal with the crime and clean up the pollution, et cetera. So it's not a good measure of social policy or social well-being. And yet most governments around the world still follow or rely on GDP as the goal. So it's going to take shifting that goal to something much broader. And I'll mention one particular attempt to come up with an alternative measure. It's called the genuine progress indicator. And what this does is account for inequality, because we know that if you're talking about welfare instead of just income, you have to think of how that income is distributed. And we know that inequality has been getting much worse in many countries. And that does not contribute to good social capital. It does not contribute to a higher sense of well-being. If you take that into account, you add some things that are left out of GDP, like the value of volunteer work, the value of household labor. These are obvious good things, but they're not marketed, so they're not included. And subtract all the things that should not be included. So including the damages to our natural capital. Once you do that, you see that since about 1980 or so, the genuine progress globally and in many countries has been stagnant or going down. So we've not really been improving genuine progress and overall well-being for decades now. So that's something that obviously needs to change, and we need to address by taking a much broader vision of what well-being means. And GPI is by no means the perfect indicator. I think there's a lot of work still to do on developing a broader consensus on what should be included in measures of well-being. And there's a lot of activity these days around that topic. And literally hundreds of alternative indicators have been proposed. So I think what's needed now really is to build some broad consensus around those indicators, because I think they do overlap and to quite an extent, and they're not as different as you might think. So that's a real issue, and we are here in 2022. We are at the 50th anniversary of the publication of a famous document, the original Limits to Growth, that was published in 1972. And the Club of Rome has been having some events to celebrate that anniversary, and has produced a new volume called Earth for All, which is an updated computer model and a couple of scenarios going forward, looking at all the things that we need to do, the transformations that are going to be necessary if we hope to achieve this good Anthropocene, a sustainable and desirable future. And it's, it's amazing that that was 50 years ago, the limits to growth came out, and there's been many publications and studies since then. It was also the date of the first Stockholm Conference on the Environment. And so I think we've known about these problems. We've known about growing human impacts on the environment. We've known about climate change impacts. We've known about many of the problems with GDP for decades now, and yet we're not making progress as quickly as we could. And so one question that we've had is, well, what's standing in the way? Why are we not making faster progress? And so one way of looking at it is to recognize that in a very real sense, we are addicted to or locked into the current system. It's hard to make those significant changes because I think ultimately all of the positive feedback loops in the system are keeping things the way they are, making it difficult to change. So the question becomes, well, if we're addicted, what's the therapy? How do we get out of that addiction? And one way of looking at it, we looked at, well, what sort of therapies work at the individual scale, and could we scale up those kinds of ideas? And it turns out that at the individual scale, the worst thing you can do really is to confront addicts with the problem and tell them, they have to change. That usually gets a very denial kind of reaction. And yet that's sort of the approach we've been taking at the societal level, and making those studies, stronger and more clear. It's true in both cases, that the damages are becoming worse, but it doesn't necessarily change behavior. So one therapy that seems to work quite well is something called motivational interviewing, where the strategy is for the therapist to engage the addict in a discussion of their life goals, take them out of the present into the future and say, what are you trying to achieve with your life? And once that's been established, then that can help to motivate the difficult changes in behavior that are necessary to achieve those life goals. So the obvious analogy, I think, at the societal scale is, how do we build a shared vision of societal's life goals? What does a sustainable and desirable future look like? The UN Sustainable Development Goals process, I think, is a really important step in that direction. It's the first time really in human history that all countries in the world have signed on to a set of goals that are much broader than simply growing GDP as quickly as possible, reducing poverty and hunger, urgent action on climate, protecting the natural environment. So all of the things we've been talking about, reducing inequality, are all embedded in those goals. I think the challenge now is to broaden that discussion beyond the international policy sphere and get it to the general public. How do we make it clear to people that there are alternative futures? There is a positive future that's possible if we're willing to make the changes that are needed in the short term. And I think that's what's needed to really motivate those changes. And we're talking about the need for urgent action. Well, how do we motivate that urgent action if we're still stuck in, locked into, addicted to the current system? And so this idea of focusing more on what an alternative and positive future could look like, and getting a very broad consensus on that future, I think, is something that could help us get there. And I'll mention one other initiative, I guess, before I stop, and that's trying to head in this direction. It's called the Wellbeing Economy Alliance. And the idea there is that there are, in fact, many, many groups and individuals around the world that are all, I think, thinking along the same lines. But that's not apparent. The strength of that movement is really not apparent, I think, to the news media, to the general public. And we all trying to build that broad alliance going forward. And it includes a few vanguard governments that have committed to changing the goals away from GDP growth and toward well-being. New Zealand is one of those. Scotland really was the leader. And there's a really good TED talk by Nicola Sturgeon along these lines. But this group now includes Scotland, Finland, New Zealand, Iceland, Wales, and Canada think it's just joined. So there is some movement, and I think the world can make the transformations that we're talking about, hopefully more quickly than has been the case in the past. But I think these kind of social transformations do happen as tipping point kind of events. And I think we are approaching the tipping point, both on the social side, but also on the biophysical side. And hopefully we can win that race. And I'll stop there. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. That was a really, really great summary of some of the complex challenges that we face. A lot to dig into in a little bit more detail. I'd like to start with the point you were raising at the beginning, and you mentioned Kate Raworth's work around donut economics, and that we need to think not only in terms of the ecological boundaries, but also how do we lift people up into having good quality of life, that whole question of well-being. Mm-hmm. We've just hit 8 billion people. We're set to continue growing for several billion more. How, with the different pathways and the visions that you've been working on and working with others on for the future, how do we make those numbers add up? A lot of our audience come from a finance background, so thinking of it in terms of the numbers is often really helpful. So how can we get the kind of scale of a shift that we really need to address both lifting up from a social perspective and really lowering from an environmental?
Right, and this idea of contraction and convergence has been brought up as one strategy for how to think about that. That in the quote unquote overdeveloped economies, in the north, that we're producing and consuming more than we really need. And so the idea is, if we refocus on well-being rather than simply consumption, and if we focus more on sufficiency and stability and equity, really, that we could improve the overall level of well-being in those countries, and at the same time reduce the level of material production and consumption. We can be more efficient with our energy use and all of our material use in the first place. We can do more circular kinds of economies that don't require as many resources, etc. On that side, in the less developed countries, developed in a sense, I mean, we don't want them to replicate the mistakes that we've made in the north, and create a different path to development, a different kind of development that really is much more focused on improving well-being. And that's going to require, again, a focus on equity in terms of distribution, a focus on not maximizing material consumption, but maximizing well-being. And that has to do with education and health and housing and security in all of those areas, rather than the competition that often is often associated with it now. So even in developing countries, inequity is even worse than it is in many northern countries. So how do we solve that problem? And I think that's a key element, and to get off the addiction to growth bandwagon. That this growth is not going to solve all of our problems. In fact, it's making many of our problems worse. And it's not growth that we're after in the first place. That's really a means to an end. And like any complex organism, growth occurs, yes, for a while, but eventually that growth should level off, and we could continue to develop. I don't want to continue growing any further, and I'm sure you don't either. And I don't think that our economies need to do that, especially on a finite planet like the one we're on.
And you mentioned a few examples of countries at that national nation state level that have started to really shift how they think about measuring progress. So taking somewhere like New Zealand or Wales, Scotland, can you say a little bit more about some of the things that they've done and how that is shifting the kind of decisions that are being taken by those governments, and indeed by the parts of the economy that might make up the economy as a whole. So thinking of businesses, investors, consumers as well.
Yeah. Well, it certainly hasn't been without resistance in those countries, and like any addiction, it's not going to be easy to overcome, and there will be relapses. But I think their fundamental change that they're making is just what I was talking about. That in fact they want to judge policies in terms of, are they improving the well-being of the population? Or not, and if they're not, then they should not necessarily be encouraged. So investing in fossil fuels, for example, or subsidizing fossil fuels, really should no longer be something that's done, because we know that that's not in the best interest of the population. That's not going to improve well-being, even if it does improve GDP growth. And I think the war in Ukraine has really sort of brought that to a head, and just how dependent we still are on fossil fuels in many countries. And so it's really providing perhaps the crisis necessary to get over that dependence, and to make the transition to renewables at the speed that we really need to, because we know that in fact those renewable resources are cheaper now anyway. So the only thing standing in the way is the addiction to the current system.
And in terms of, you touched on some of the international processes that, and particularly thinking of the Sustainable Development Goals, which were set in 2015, targeting 2030. We're pretty much halfway through, not far off.
Yeah.
You also have had a number of other UN processes looking at some of the specific issues. So we not so long ago had COP27 looking at the latest of the climate negotiations. We now have COP15 focused on biodiversity. How do you see some of those different processes connecting? So one thing that is a big focus as part of COP15 is looking at some of the nature-based solutions, and that clearly underpins human well-being, has a major impact on our own well-being, as well as helping to combat some of the climate issues. Is that something that you think organizations should be focusing on more? Are there some actions we could be taking there?
Yeah, no, as I mentioned, I think ecosystem services, nature-based solutions, I think that's definitely the way to go going forward, because I think that has a much better return on investment than investing in hard infrastructure in many cases, including for climate-related issues. Sequestering carbon in wetlands and forests is a much better option than other more technological means. But and also protecting cities from flooding and from storms. We've done studies that show that coastal wetlands are much more valuable than in that regard than the built alternatives. So making those kinds of investments only makes, it makes just total sense once you begin to be able to recognize the benefits of those natural systems. And I think that's what we're better able to do these days. We know that once those values are more tangible in the sense of measurable, then those investments look good. But I think it's also a challenge for how we manage in general these common assets, like the atmosphere, like watersheds, like the deep oceans. And I think we do need some new kinds of institutions to manage those assets and to allow for the public and private investments in these bigger assets. So this idea of common asset trusts is one that we've been exploring, to think of the whole watershed or the whole atmosphere really as a common asset that is owned by all of us, not privatized, but owned by the whole community. And once you've made that sort of leap in terms of ownership, then you begin to say, well, those parties that damage that asset that belongs to all of us should be charged for those damages, and those that improve the asset, should be rewarded for those improvements. So we could begin to charge, for example, fossil fuel companies directly for the damages to our common asset, put those funds into a trust, and use that trust to mitigate those damages and to compensate those that have been harmed by those damages. So those kinds of ideas, I think, need to percolate a little bit more. It's not so much, having governments negotiate with each other and make agreements that they really have no way of implementing, to getting towards a more of a common asset management framework and beginning to deal with the parties that are actually damaging our common assets.
In terms of achieving progress towards that kind of trust, or that kind of new set of global governance arrangements that are really needed to provide that kind of investment and that kind of common protection, as you highlighted earlier, if you put monetary value on whether it's the ecosystem services that we benefit from, or a lot of the natural assets, the returns are very good, but because those returns don't necessarily flow in money terms to individuals or to organizations or to governments in the way that a lot of more financial based assets do, and that's clearly part of the challenge. So are there some actions that you are seeing being taken, or some progress that you're seeing made that gives you hope that we might reach that kind of new form of global governance in time, to avoid the tipping points you mentioned being reached?
Yeah, well, the in time thing is something I can't predict, but I think by arranging things this way, I think we could build much better public-private partnerships, because if you think of a natural capital asset, and it's going to have a combination of private investments and public investments. And if you can determine, well, what are the private returns to those investments versus the public returns, because there are going to be private returns, there's going to be both. And we can't expect either of those parties to do all of the investment when they're only reaping, a part of the reward. But I think if the more that we can understand and quantify the relative returns to private versus public parties, the better we can do at arranging these public-private partnerships. And I think that's really what we need, because we do need massive investments, in our natural capital assets to restore the environment, to really move forward with the challenges that we're facing with climate and biodiversity and with well-being.
And we're nearly out of time, but I'd like to just hear from you thoughts on also closing some of the knowledge and skills gaps. So you're based at UCL. Certainly from the work that we do, we work a lot with the finance world, and building the kind of collaborative processes across, you really need that cross-disciplinary approach to understand and respond to some of these challenges. You're starting to see more mandatory requirements, certainly at the company level, in terms of how they measure across the broad range of sustainable development goal related issues. So whether that might be around natural capital, social, human capital. But a lot of those who might traditionally be tasked with that measurement, they're not necessarily have the different backgrounds around something like the environmental issue. So how do you see a multidisciplinary approach emerging? Is that something that you're seeing? And how do we really make sure that we're upskilling everyone who needs to have that base level of knowledge to be able to take action?
Yeah, that is a real challenge in higher education and education at all levels. But I'm seeing some progress in that direction. So institutes like the one I'm now part of, the Institute for Global Prosperity, is very transdisciplinary oriented. And it's trying to educate our students in just those kinds of problem solving skills that build on inputs from wherever they're needed. And I think going forward, that's the kind of education that people are going to need more of, because the problems that we're facing are not within single disciplines. Not all, that's not true of all of them, but many of them are not going to yield to single discipline kind of approaches. And the siloed approach that universities have traditionally been set up in, and governments and businesses to a certain extent, is something that we need to really reduce and deal with if we're gonna make the progress that we need to make. Thanks.
And if there's one final thought or recommendation, action that you would like to see people taking, what's that one really key takeaway from the discussion that we've had?
Well, I've been thinking a lot lately, because a lot of the recommendations that come out, these final words, are, okay, what can you do as an individual to help solve this problem? And I think that's often a bit of a distraction, because I don't think any individual actions by themselves are gonna make the difference that needs to happen. So what we do need to do is to change the system, essentially. And the first step in changing the system, I think, is to change the goals that the system is headed toward. And so it gets back to my idea about how do we build this shared vision of the world we want. And I would ask people to think about, what kind of world they would like to see for their children and grandchildren. Not what the next step is, but what does the world look like in 20 or 30 years? And are the things that we're doing now helping us to get to that world? Because I think there would be quite a lot of agreement, really, about what that world could or should look like. I don't think there's as much disagreement there as you might see in the world today. So let's try to build that shared vision of the world we want, and use that to motivate helping us get there.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. Really great to hear from you. And I will look forward to posing some of those challenges and asking people to share some of their own thoughts on the vision that they might want. As you say, I suspect there's a lot of common ground there, and something that we can all think about how we can work towards more effectively than we are at the moment.
Great. Thank you.